So I think the way we'll run this, we'll just have it be an open question and answer, but as the moderators, we're going to take the prerogative to ask the first questions, and then we'll open it up to the room. So I guess I'll start. Glenn, given the importance of whistleblowers in exposing corruption, can you tell us a little bit about the best way to incentivize and to protect whistleblowers?
Yeah, to me, if you're entering journalism now or working in journalism now, that for me is really the central question. And I think it's so important to think about the changes that have taken place and how power centers, which ultimately if you're going to be a journalist should be your target of scrutiny and inquiry, how they keep information out, which is almost entirely digitally. And so as a result, it's become much, much easier for people to take information from them about what it is they're doing in the dark and give them to people like me who can then report on that to the public or to all of you once you start doing journalism as well. And it's a huge change because probably the most significant whistleblower of the prior generation is Daniel Ellsberg, who, as some of you might know, in 1971 got a hold of huge numbers of volumes of top secret documents from the Pentagon that proved that the US government was systematically lying to the public about the Vietnam War, telling the public that they were winning the war when they knew they were losing, and the documents all showed this. And he wanted to be an Edward Snowden before there was an Edward Snowden. He wanted to give it to members of Congress, and when that failed, give it to the New York Times. And so his big challenge, and I've heard him tell this story, it's really amazing to listen to him. His big challenge was he had 40,000 pages of top secret documents. How do you make a copy of it and then get it to a newspaper? Do you like go to the drugstore with a huge bag of nickels and like pull one in after the next and literally make photocopies of it? And so flash forward 40 years later, you have Chelsea Manning, who's able to get one of the most valuable archives in the history of journalism showing war crimes by multiple nations. She downloaded it literally while listening to a Lady Gaga album, like a single time. That's how fast it was. When Snowden gave me the archive, it was on tiny little thumb drives, even though the size of it was gargantuan.
Yeah.
So this is something that your government here in Canada, my government for certain, the government of the UK, lots of governments in the West and in other parts of the world are obsessed with stopping. How do you prevent people from transmitting all of their data to places they don't want it to be, namely in the eyes of the public? And so they're developing technology to constantly monitor that and detect what people are doing. That's why they're so obsessed with surveillance. It's not to catch terrorists, certainly not entirely. It's to prevent journalism from being done or activists from organizing. And so as a journalist, it is now my responsibility, just like it is of a human rights activist or a lawyer, to think about how to protect that process through things like encryption and offering as much security and safety to those people as you possibly can, because that does become your responsibility. And so I think the kind of responsibilities and ethics of a journalist have really expanded now because that question is really front and center, whereas 15, 20 years ago it didn't exist.
Let me ask a follow-up to that. You, Edward Snowden, Daniel Ellsberg, a number of people have been, Jesselyn Radick, have been very critical of the previous administration in the US, the Obama administration, of using the Espionage Act more times than all other presidents combined. I did a story in January for the New York Times on this very topic. The argument that DOJ and others make is exactly what you just said, which is that it's so much easier to steal huge volumes. You said Daniel Ellsberg had paper. There's only so much he could take. But now you could take so much on a 2 terabyte hard drive that you can put in your inside pocket that the stakes are much higher. Therefore, they've had to respond with due force. Do you buy that argument? And if not, I have a feeling you don't, then why was the previous administration, and I think all indication is this administration, going so hard against whistleblowers?
Yeah, so I do not buy that argument as you correctly predicted. I actually find that incredibly preposterous because the nature of the act isn't affected one way or the other by the ease with which it's effectuated. You can have an incredibly damaging act 50 years ago through a Xerox machine or a fax machine, and a really noble leak through digital transmission. So I don't think there's any connection between the means of transmission and the nature of what the leak is. I think that what's really going on is what I alluded to before, which is, there was some protection for the most powerful factions 20, 30 years ago. If we're talking about governments that are corrupt or corporate offices where there was just a logistical barrier about how they could get information out. And also it was much easier to protect, right? So if you have just a single set of paper, you can lock it in a cabinet, in a vault, wherever, and it's really hard to get it, let alone to transmit it. Whereas now, with computer networks being much more easily accessed by not just whistleblowers, but hackers and non-state actors, it's a lot easier to get. So it's really difficult to prevent physically this information being transmitted. So if you're the US government, if you're the CIA, if you're the Canadian authorities who work on surveillance here, or if you're huge corporations, how do you then prevent people from taking your data and giving it to the public? You can't physically stop it because there's no technological solution that will enable them to prevent it. What you want to do instead is you want to create a climate of fear. Right. Where if you are a young person working inside of a government agency or a corporation and you discover systematic wrongdoing like the finalists tonight all did, and you want to expose it, they want you to think, if I go and do this, I'm not going to get here as welcome. I'm going to instead be thrown into a dungeon and tortured for 7 years like Chelsea Manning was. Or I'm going to be treated like a spy, like the Obama administration treated whistleblowers. As you said, they prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all previous presidents combined. And the reason is exactly what I just said, that the only hope that they have to stop the next Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning or Daniel Ellsberg is to make them so petrified of what will be done to them, to their lives, that they just think twice about it.
Well, we'll open up to the group here.
Just one over here, Glenn, you just touched on it briefly there about the finalists tonight and their work on systematic wrongdoing. I wonder if you could just give us your impressions of the work of the three finalists.
Yeah, it's interesting because the two women who are two of the three finalists, one from Egypt who is Aza Salman, and the other is Kaja Ismailova from Azerbaijan, have a lot in common. They've both been really systemically persecuted by their authoritarian regimes because of, in the case of Ismailova, the journalism that she's doing, and in the case of Salman, because of the activism that she's been engaged in. And I think that there's a really important lesson there, which is a lot of us like to think about ourselves and talk about ourselves as being willing to stand up to power and confront power. And I'm sure, you know, if any of you, you know, as journalism students, you've all thought about that part of your work in some way. And I know for me personally, when I used to just talk about it, I thought I had an idea of what that meant, and you don't really have an idea of what it means, and you definitely don't know your capacity to actually do it until you're actually confronted with it. Because if you think about what the nature of power is, to say that somebody's powerful, what does that mean? It means that they have the capacity to inflict some kind of negative consequences on you, some kind of suffering or punishment, if you do something that defies them or impedes their interests. And you look at these two incredibly brave women who have been subjected to all kinds of punishment. I mean, serious threats from governments that really have very little compunction about crossing all kinds of lines, and yet they've just persisted and continued with their work in ways that are really remarkable and courageous. And then you have the prosecutors in Brazil, who have a slightly different situation because they actually have a popular sentiment behind them. They've become kind of national heroes in Brazil. I know their case best because I live in Brazil. But at the same time, I mean, Brazil is a country that, even though it's a democracy for about 30 years, has been run on systematic corruption, just kind of like organized criminality. They don't have, like we have or you have, some individually corrupt politicians. Their entire political class just runs on corruption. It's just like an organized crime ring. And they've done it with complete impunity for decades. It's just been part of the perk of being a politician, is you get to steal money and get bribes and have Swiss bank accounts and live a really wealthy life. And you have this set of young prosecutors, largely young prosecutors, who were born into a country that by that point was basically democratized. And they had been taught as children for the first time, for the first generation of Brazilians, that the rule of law matters, that institutions have to function in accordance with principles. And they apparently took it really seriously in a way that I don't think was intended. And they have put one after the next of the most powerful people in prison. Billionaires, oligarchs, and lords of political power. They're in prison, and there's really no end in sight. And as an American who lived through, the Wall Street fraud, the great Wall Street fraud of 2008 that caused economic suffering and still does all around the world, and then watches the Obama administration protected every single one of them, not a single one of them went to prison, or, being in a country, a citizen of a country whose government tortured people and committed war crimes as part of the war on terror, and the Obama administration protected all of them as well. To watch the most powerful people in a country be held accountable in the most serious way is really quite extraordinary. And so I personally have some criticism of some of the things these prosecutors have done because they've had some really hard choices to make, and I don't think they've always made the right choice. But overall, their work is also really brave in a somewhat different way than those two women. But I think that that's what all three of them have in common, is just this kind of courage to persist with this mission, regardless of the consequences.
You exist in a club alongside Richard Nixon and Alexander the Great. What's it like for Oliver Stone to make a movie about you?
Oh, that's why. Because Oliver Stone made a movie. That included me. All right, good. I was searching for the commonality, not finding it until you shared it. Yeah, I guess what I would say is that if you wanted to watch a film about the whole Snowden story, I would actually recommend the documentary that was made by my colleague Laura Poitras, that won the Academy Award in 2014. Because it's not fictionalized, she actually filmed what was taking place, for those of you who haven't seen it. The work that we did when we met Snowden in this tiny little hotel room in Hong Kong, and sort of the things we navigated. It's the Oliver Stone film, I mean, it's just extremely uncomfortable to even just watch yourself on a screen being portrayed by an actor. The actor who portrayed me was Zach Quinto, who is best known for his work in the Star Trek films, I guess. And the whole thing was just a very strange experience. I'm just not the best person to comment on that film. But I think that the film did a good job, actually, of answering this question, which I think is a really fascinating question that I'm actually going to talk about tonight, which is, Edward Snowden. What makes it the whole story for me so extraordinary was that Edward Snowden is a similar age to a lot of you in this room. I mean, when I met him, he was 29 years old. He was somebody who grew up pretty poor. His father was in the Coast Guard for 30 years. They were basically lower middle class. He dropped out of high school. He didn't finish high school, so he had no position or prestige in the society. Is very, very ordinary. And yet, through nothing more than this kind of act of courage, this act of conscience, he changed the world. He did. Whatever you think of him, whatever you think of the results, I mean, he altered relations diplomatically between countries. He radically changed how people think about privacy and surveillance and secrecy and the role of journalism and democracy and a whole variety of other issues. And I think there's some really important lessons there about what you're capable of as a person, even if you don't have lots of power, in terms of your ability to confront formidable institutions. And I think that film did a pretty decent job of kind of exploring that psychological trajectory. Like, my big question when I met him that I really needed an answer to was, what would drive someone that young, to risk the rest of their lives? I mean, we assume that his almost definite outcome was going to be spending the next 5 decades in a cage in an American prison, maximum security prison. What would drive somebody to take that risk in pursuit of some abstract political principle? Which is a question that I have about the finalists tonight too. Like, why do this woman in Azerbaijan and the other one in Egypt, why are they willing to go to prison and have their assets frozen and be threatened in all kinds of ways, their physical well-being, their legal rights, just to expose some corruption? Like, what drives that? That's, I think, the essence of who we are and the role we want to play in society, and I actually think that film did a decent job of exploring that question.
They're in the back.
Hey, thanks a lot for being here. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about the criticisms of the car wash task force.
Yeah, I'm trying so hard to suppress those because I'm supposed to be here to talk positively about the nominees, and now you're antagonizing me, so I'm going to go ahead and succumb to your temptations because I don't have a lot of discipline. So I do want to say that, like, overall, I do actually believe what I said earlier, which is that what they have done has been pretty impressive. But there were actually a lot of protests when the Allard Prize announced that they were a finalist, and there was a huge movement in Brazil, especially among the Brazilian leftists, to try and pressure me to withdraw from coming here and speaking, which I never considered doing. But they are really controversial in Brazil. I guess I would say a couple things. I mean, one is if you do brave anti-corruption work, on some level it's not actually a popularity contest. The work that I did with Snowden had a lot of support around the world, but a lot of people really hated it. It was extremely divisive in the United States. Also here in Canada, I remember in the parliament, some right-wing politician who was part of the Harper government stood up and called me, I forget what it was, like a porn spy or something. Anyway, you're not gonna be popular with everybody when you do this kind of work. In their case, they're prosecutors, and so there's a lot of legal rights at stake in terms of what they're doing. One of the things that I found highly questionable that they did was they released some taped telephone conversations between the then president of the country, Dilma Rousseff, and the former president, Lula da Silva. Not just ones that were of public interest, but where they were having kind of personal conversations designed to embarrass them. That seemed to me an abuse of their prosecutorial power. There are a lot of people who think, and I think it's not invalid, that they've been much more kind of tenacious about prosecuting left-wing politicians, including the governing party of PT, than they have politicians on the right who have been largely, though not entirely, left unscathed. So I think, but I think that, the reason why I was willing to come and the reason why on balance I'm actually, I have admiration for what they've done is because I know from experience that when you do something where you're confronting the most powerful factions, you don't have an instruction guide for telling you what to do. There's no handbook for it. Sometimes you have to be creative and resourceful. Sometimes you have to take risks. Sometimes you have to make really hard judgments. I think we made mistakes in terms of the Snowden reporting that we did sometimes, things that I would do differently if I could do them over again. So I do think there are some valid critiques of them. But on balance, to watch billionaires and leading politicians go to prison for corruption that they clearly engaged in, I'm going to have more good things than bad things to say about the people responsible for that.
I think what you said about, there's no handbook, I think that applies to journalists as well as prosecutors. You see that with WikiLeaks, they made lots of mistakes, but a lot of people would say on balance, they've increased transparency, and likewise with you guys. You got some criticism for and Snowden got some criticism for some things getting out that weren't meant to get out, but it's a tough thing to do.
Yeah, exactly.
And another thing I would say after speaking with the task force last night, whatever they do will be used by politicians. So, every act that they make when they're going after the most, sort of elite people in society is either going to be, political one way or political another way. So,
Well, that's what I was saying earlier. I think
Yeah.
that's exactly right. Part of what happens when you confront powerful factions is they have massive megaphones. And so all of your
And lots of
mistakes
lawyers.
and lots of everything, and lots of influence with the media
Yeah.
that needs them for access. And so all of your mistakes, no matter how small, get very magnified. I used to always be amazed, sometimes we would publish documents that were controversial and we would get criticized by various members of the US intelligence community, and they would say, you made a mistake in publishing this document. I would say, okay, we did maybe make a mistake. In this case, it was a hard call, it was a judgment call, but you guys invaded Iraq. You thought weapons of mass destruction, and they didn't. And you set up a worldwide torture regime and stuff. So I don't really feel like you're very qualified to sit in judgment of us. And I think that is important, is that we're all human beings and we're flawed, and there's a tendency at events like this to kind of idealize the people that are being honored. And they all have made mistakes. I think all three of the finalists have valid critiques that have been voiced against them, because the work is difficult and the work is risky. And you're absolutely right. One of the strategies of the people they target is to kind of exploit those mistakes to discredit the entire project.
And you get the press. There's a lot of fake news involved.
Yeah,
as well,
absolutely.
I understand. Yeah. All right. Over there. With your, yeah, you at the end. Yeah, you.
What would you do differently in your reporting on Snowden?
I knew you were going to ask that. I totally invited that.
It's the danger of being in a room with journalists.
Yeah. There were some really high pressured situations that are very difficult to know how to manage sometimes. Probably the most difficult moment for me was when my husband was detained for 12 hours at Heathrow Airport in London when he was coming back from visiting Allard Prize in Germany, and the British authorities knew he was carrying documents that I needed from her, and they detained him and threatened him and held him under a terrorism law. And I was really angry about that. So when he finally got released, which we weren't certain was going to happen, and he got on a plane to fly back to Brazil, where I was waiting for him. I went to the airport. It was 4 a.m. when his plane got in, and there was enormous numbers of media there. And when I walked in, the media ran over to me and they asked me, how I felt about it, and I made some sort of statements I sort of went into this mode of sounding like a James Bond villain. I was like, the UK government is going to regret what they did. We have all these documents about their bad deeds that we're now going to publish, and it made it sound like I was using the archive as a tool of vengeance, because they had detained my husband, and on some level, there was a sentiment of that at that moment, just in the sort of heat of the moment, and after all that happened, and they used that a lot against me. It was headlines all over the world. Glenn Greenwald threatens the UK government. It made it sound like I was using journalism as some kind of tool of war. So, that's what I was kind of talking about earlier. You get put into situations that are extremely difficult, that you haven't been in before, and that nobody has taught you or trained you or prepared you about what to do. There were some difficult documents that we had to make serious choices about. Does the risk of publishing this document and the harm that it might cause outweigh the public benefit? And you were saying earlier we've been criticized because certain documents we published, some people thought we shouldn't, and that's true. But we've also been criticized because some people think we haven't published enough. Go talk to Julian Assange and he'll be happy to tell you all about that. So how you balance that, your responsibilities and ethical duties as a journalist and as a human being, your duties to the public versus, your duties not to put innocent people at risk, those are really hard choices, and I think some of the decisions we made, probably weren't the best ones. But I think on balance, I'm very proud of the work we did. All I'm saying is that, I know personally that there were some really hard questions, and so I try and be generous in how I'm judging other people in similar situations.
Right.
You mentioned about the way evolving technology is affecting the transmission of raw material. How about on the other end of the reception by the public? How is social media and these sort of evolving things changing the way power can be attacked, and in particular, the way things like fake news is trying to undermine that, maybe,
Yeah, I think these are very complex questions. So, for a long time, or not for a long time, but for a pretty short period of time in the U.S., and I think now in Western Europe as well, there's this kind of obsession with the idea that Silicon Valley companies need to save our democracy by more aggressively regulating our political speech. So Mark Zuckerberg needs to figure out what's fake and what's true, and in his infinite wisdom, allow what's true to be published and suppress what's false. And I'm very, very wary of this entire discussion, because I think, if you talk to Edward Snowden about that question I raised earlier, why as a young person were you willing to go to prison for many decades in defense of this abstract principle called internet freedom, he'll tell you, as somebody who was poor and wasn't able to explore the world by traveling and doing other things, the internet was a really critical innovation for him. It was really a way that he was able to explore and understand not just the world but himself. And he knew that in order for it to remain valuable that way, it had to remain free. And so all of these different means of trying to gain incursion into controlling the internet, inventing this concept called fake news that's completely ill-defined. What is fake news? Is it just when the New York Times every day was publishing that Saddam Hussein had a nuclear weapons program, was that fake news? Should that have been suppressed? Does it require intent? How do you judge intent? Who's going to judge that? I get very alarmed about any of those kinds of questions. I do think that the internet remains this kind of unique hope for undermining these increasingly centralized and powerful institutions, and I do worry that any efforts to control it or censor it or call on companies to do so or empowering governments to do so in the name of security or decency or protecting the discourse are far more dangerous than the benefits they might afford.
So I just have a question about, so when Edward Snowden approached you, he kind of said that he wanted to go to journalists because he wanted them to kind of act as the gatekeepers, and he didn't want to be the one making the decisions about what to release. Whereas Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks, they kind of just dump information all over the internet. So I was just wondering if you could talk about the difference between those two strategies and the implications for the public.
Sure. So first of all, let me just quibble a little bit with your premise. I don't think it's entirely accurate to say that Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks just took a bunch of documents and indiscriminately dumped them on the internet. in fact, Chelsea Manning, I think you have to distinguish between the various actors. So Chelsea Manning was really the source, like Edward Snowden was our source. She was the one who furnished the documents to WikiLeaks and asked WikiLeaks to act as a journalist, essentially a media outlet, a journalistic outlet, in terms of deciding what material should be published and how it ought to be published. The perception is that WikiLeaks just dumped everything. The reality is, and I know because I was participating in the debates at the time very vigorously in defense of WikiLeaks, the reality is that WikiLeaks went, instead of just dumping it on the internet, they actually went to newspapers like the New York Times and The Guardian and El País in Spain and a few others, and worked on how to curate that material. They redacted stuff. They asked the State Department to meet with them over what should be redacted. The State Department refused, but they did try. There did come a time a few years later because of a dispute over a password with The Guardian where WikiLeaks made the decision to just publish it all on the internet. But originally the way it was reported was not completely dissimilar to the way that Edward Snowden asked us to do it, which was to curate the material, to withhold information that could harm innocent people and the like. And this gets to the question that we were talking about earlier with espionage and the like too. And the reason that I find it so offensive that sources now are prosecuted under statutes designed to punish spies. To me, a spy, somebody who commits espionage, is somebody who takes secret information and sells it to an adversarial foreign agency in exchange for money, or who just gives it in order to subvert or harm their own government. That's what a spy is. Somebody who goes to a journalist, the way that Chelsea Manning actually did, the way Edward Snowden slightly differently, but fundamentally similarly did as well, and asked journalists to pick and choose what information is needed to improve the public discourse and inform the public of what's taking place, that person is a whistleblower by definition and not a spy. And to prosecute those people as spies, I think, is an incredible abuse of power. But the question you asked is a good one because a lot of the leaks have been indiscriminate dumping, like the leak where somebody whose identity is still unknown, the US government thinks it's North Korea, but we don't actually know, took the entire archive of Sony emails and dumped those onto the internet. WikiLeaks did get the emails from the DNC and John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign chief in 2016, and just indiscriminately dumped that on the internet. So that question, if you get a large archive of data, what is your responsibility for how you put it in the public hands? Do you take the position, I'm a journalist, I'm not going to be like the government and hide things, I'm just going to let the public see it all? Or do you have professional and ethical duties as both a journalist and a human being to minimize the harm that you cause through your actions? I personally very strongly believe in the latter model, but there is a debate among transparency activists and even some journalists about which is the better approach.
I'm just curious as to how you've dealt with the fact that Snowden's asylum was eventually granted in Russia, which is a country that does have sort of a problematic relationship with freedom of information internally, and that it might sort of be manipulated and turned into kind of a Cold War narrative. And how you might have had to deal with backlash and how, as far as I know, he did.
So I guess I would say a couple things about that. One is that the United States all the time grants asylum to people, and I don't know why I never hear anybody saying to people who get granted asylum in the United States, like, hey, how do you feel about being granted asylum in a country that has imprisoned huge numbers of people in this place called Guantanamo for 16 years now without any trial or due process of any kind? Or how do you feel about being given asylum in a country that goes around the world bombing whoever they want to without any kind of parameters legally or ethically? All countries in the world are imperfect and engage in lots of human rights abuses, especially the largest ones. And the nature of asylum is not to find the civil liberties nirvana and then seek refuge there. The nature of asylum is that people are being persecuted by their own government unjustly for the exercise of their civic and political rights, and then other countries actually have the duty by treaty and convention to protect them from that persecution. And the fact that those countries granting the asylum also, on the other side of the ledger, persecute their own citizens or their own whistleblowers or their own activists doesn't in any way make the asylum weird to me, because if it did, then which country is qualified to offer asylum? We did know that him going to Russia was going to be used against him, and I think this is such an important point. The US government also knew that if he were in Russia, they could use that against him. And they're the ones that caused him to be there. I think a lot of people have forgotten this, sort of high drama that took place when he left Hong Kong. And he was on a plane, and the international media was chasing him, trying to figure out what plane he was on. He was actually transiting through Moscow on his way to Havana with the intention of going to a northern country in South America. Venezuela or Ecuador or Bolivia was still being negotiated. And in transit from Hong Kong to Moscow, the US government revoked his passport, so that by the time he got to the international zone in the Moscow airport, he was no longer able to board an international flight because he no longer had a valid passport. And then he got trapped there for 38 days because of the US government. So it's always so amazing to me that the US government, on the one hand, forced him to be in a place he never chose to be, which was Russia, and then on the other hand turns around and uses that to impugn his integrity. Oh, look, he's in Russia. That's somehow, a mark against him. So I think the much more important question to ask is not why is Edward Snowden in Russia, but why is the United States government so eager to take people who, in a very responsible way, expose things that they're doing that their own courts have said are illegal, and put those people into a dungeon for the next 60 years. If they didn't do that, he wouldn't have to be in Russia.
In Canada, we don't have the same protection for journalist sources as you guys do in America. They're maybe coming up in court, for example. I'm curious as to what your advice would be for journalists on how to get whistleblowers to talk to us, knowing that information, and then also how to protect them afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, like we were talking about earlier, I mean, I think this is the critical question. As if any of you know the story that I wrote in my book, or about how my interaction with Snowden was at first, when he first contacted me, for obvious reasons, he was unwilling to speak to me until I installed extremely advanced forms of encryption. Because he knew what the capabilities of the NSA were, and he, for good reason, wasn't willing to tell me that he had taken hundreds of thousands of documents on open internet lines. And at the time, I was a person who just felt like the word encryption was creepy. Like, I didn't want anything to do with it. It was like, that sounds like something computer nerds do. Yeah, it's like, I'm not one of those kind of people who's going to be installing encryption. And this is very common among journalists. Almost no one I knew used encryption. Even, the top level national security journalists at the New York Times who spoke to the most sensitive sources and published all kinds, they didn't use encryption either. Virtually nobody used encryption. Now, fast forward 3 years later, I pretty much won't talk to anybody who doesn't use encryption. And every journalist I know uses it. Every human rights activist I know uses it. Lawyers I know use it. Anybody who has the responsibility to protect the privacy of their communications use it. It is your responsibility to master that technology because, as you know, you have an obligation to protect the anonymity and safeguard the welfare of your sources. And you can't do that if you're ignoring or being indifferent to these technologies the way that I was in 2012 when Edward Snowden first contacted me. I do think that there still is a kind of lackadaisical attitude in a lot of professions around the world. I was just in Australia where we were working with one of the biggest media outlets there on some Snowden documents, and they just didn't have encryption, didn't care about encryption, weren't willing to listen to the reasons they should have it. And I just think that's completely reckless, knowing that we know about how governments monitor all of our communications and the ease with which they do it. So my guess is that, for young journalists, for those of you who decide that you're not interested in mastering those technologies or caring about them, you're probably not going to have many sources because sources are only going to go to people who are willing to do everything possible to protect their anonymity and to safeguard their ability to remain out of prison.
But
So
there's still the issue, though he raised that Canadian journalists can be subpoenaed in ways that U.S. journalists can't.
Well, but remember though, U.S. journalists do get subpoenaed. I think we do have moderately more source protection than you have here, but we don't have a federal shield law, for example, that says that journalists don't have to testify, and journalists do get subpoenaed all the time, and the expectation is that they're supposed to go to prison to protect their sources, and lots of journalists do. They just refuse to answer the question. So I guess that's a convention of journalism that probably is an important one and a good one. But I think there are ways to not get to that point, and I do think encryption helps to avoid that.
Can you talk about how the left media sandbag Bernie Sanders and about the kind of mind-blowing red baiting that's happening in the left media?
Are you Jimmy Dore? That was so disturbing. It just popped out of my YouTube box and appeared you exist in real life? I didn't know that you even that was possible. So you want to know how the lefty media sandbagged Bernie Sanders? Is that what you're asking?
Well, you just talked about the phenomena of that. Mort Saul told me when Bernie started running that he didn't have to worry about the right-wing media, that he's going to have to worry about the left-wing media. I thought he was, crazy because I'm young, but he was right about that. And then just again, every day, MSNBC, red-based, it is mind-blowing, and no one's trying to stop them.
So I guess what I'll say about that is, because it's a little off topic, and I'm happy to talk to you about it more for your show or just for your own personal edification if you want to chat afterwards. But I guess what I would say is when I first started writing about politics, it was 2005, and it was the Bush years. And one of the reasons I was able to develop a platform more or less quickly is because all these Democrats and all of these liberals loved the work I was doing, and they supported the work I was doing, and they helped me build my platform because at the time I was criticizing George Bush and his assault on civil liberties and his use of militarism. And I had all these supporters and who were largely Democrats and liberals because I was attacking Bush. Starting around, I don't know, I guess maybe January 20th, 2009, which is the day that George Bush left office and Obama entered office, I lost all those friends. They stopped caring about civil liberties. They stopped caring about war. The anti-war movement disappeared, even as Obama escalated bombing in lots of places and intensified civil liberties assault. And I think that what got exposed is that there really is no left-wing media in the United States. It really, what people thought was the left-wing media was actually a Democratic Party media, which is something much different. So I think that one of the interesting things about the unraveling of centrist institutions in Europe, where the Socialist Party in France has disappeared and the Blairites in the UK are completely discredited and the establishment wing of the Democratic Party is suffering so much, there's kind of an unraveling of politics, and it creates a great opportunity that can be scary on the one hand because the right, new right can take over, but the left can actually have a really interesting opportunity as well. And you see that with Jeremy Corbyn. I think you see that with a lot of energy on the left. And so rather than sit around with grievances about the past, I'm sort of more interested in kind of how these divisions can be exploited to build something better.
I wanted to ask about the Intercept and what it was like to build a new organization from the ground up. That hasn't been touched on yet.
Yeah, it was much harder than I thought it was going to be, that's for sure. So if any of you think that it's fun and easy and exciting, that's a great thing. You want that energy, but don't make the same mistake that I made in thinking that it was all going to happen quickly and in a stress-free way. One of the reasons why I made that mistake is because the principles that kind of brought us together, that caused me to leave The Guardian, that caused Jeremy Scahill to leave The Nation, and Laura Poitras to sort of put aside her work on films and create this new media organization, was we did have the energy and the wind behind us from the Snowden story. We got a lot of funding for it. We found a funder who was willing to basically fund us for as much as we wanted and make a promise that he's kept to completely keep out of our editorial process. And so we felt like we had this we were like kids in a playground who could just build a sandcastle and had all the tools that we needed. And all the kind of passion about what we wanted to do. We were going to break all the rules, and we were going to, shatter conventions, and we were going to just do journalism without regard to who we alienated and not need access into power centers. And these are exciting principles, and they still excite me to this day. But, you have to build a foundation as well as the kind of excitement. You need editors, you need people who shepherd the process, you need lawyers who are going to help protect you, you need to put a team together that works together well, that shares a common vision. You need to have, you want to give people journalistic freedom, but at the same time you want to make sure that you're covering things in a systematic way. So there's a lot of kind of personal drama for the first year, a lot of which became quite public. There were a lot of logistical difficulties. But I feel like, we've really gotten beyond that, and I'm incredibly proud of the organization that we built. I mean, just this year alone, we've added Mehdi Hassan, we've added Naomi Klein, we just added Sean King, we had Ryan Grimm from the Huffington Post, Jim Risen, the Pulitzer Prize winning national security reporter from the New York Times, all of whom have left their institutions and come to the Intercept. So I feel like we're really now, we have a bureau in Brazil that is its own sort of media outlet. I feel like we're really building the kind of media outlet based on this ethos that I really wanted. which is adversarial and independent, and willing to experiment and take risks and try new things, and most of all, just to alienate and piss off like all the people that we think deserve that. So, that's sort of the model we tried to build.
Yeah, you spoke about pissing off people. So we're living in a time when news outlets themselves have become news now. So the president calling CNN fake news, Breitbart also in the news as well, if you can call that a news outlet. So in this atmosphere, how is that playing down on the editorial board? Because journalists have to tread with caution more than ever. And how is it affecting their work?
Yeah, those are great questions. I find it so interesting that we have this situation where Donald Trump sort of, as a regular part of his daily ritual, kind of like the way some people just, eat snacks, he likes to just go and attack the media. And it really upsets journalists. They have extremely thin skins. They're very upset by this, by every time he tweets about them and calls CNN fake news or whatever, they act like it's one of the world's greatest tragedies. And there are actual attacks on a free press. I personally don't think Donald Trump tweeting mean things about a CNN anchor is an example of that. But I think the much more interesting question that we don't actually spend much time on is, why does that work? Why is that an effective tactic for him to demagogue against the media? And you see it too in the British right. You definitely see it in the Brazilian right. You see it in lots of populist movements, and I mean populist left-wing figures like to rant and rave against the media as well. Why is that an effective tactic? And the reason is because trust and confidence in media organizations have collapsed pretty severely, and polling data shows this. I think the only group of people who are less popular than the media in the United States are pedophiles or something. It's close too. So, and so you can sit around and just kind of complain about that, right? Oh, Donald Trump shouldn't say mean things about journalists. We're the lifeblood of democracy. I think a much more interesting question is, why is that effective? Why have we lost the faith and trust in among the people who are supposed to be reading this? Why are they willing to read, some sewer like Breitbart and take it seriously? Or why are they willing to, accept some fake news posting on Facebook from some news organization that doesn't even exist, that they've never heard of? Why are they willing to vest that with as much credibility, if not more, than what they read in the Washington Post or from NBC News? And until we start grappling with those questions about what it is that we've done as a collective profession that has lost the confidence of people, I think we're just going to get increasingly more unpopular, because it just seems very petulant and just unwilling to confront our own deficiencies, when all we do is sit around and demand that it's give us respect. That's not how things work. And it needs to be re-earned, and I don't see much self-contemplation about what needs to be done for that to happen.
I think we only have a few more minutes, so I'm going to maybe see if Peter has one last question. And
I actually have a question that sort of follows up on this, and actually brings us very elegantly back to the Allard Prize. It's interesting that the Allard Prize, I have nothing to do with the prize, I'm an outside observer, but it has honored both activists, prosecutors, as well as journalists. And a number of current and former students are here, and I know that a lot of young journalists grapple with the question of, am I a human rights advocate, an environmental justice advocate, a global health advocate, whatever, or am I a journalist? In the old days, you kind of had to choose. You've kind of shown that you don't have to choose. I mean, you came into journalism not through journalism, but through law, through activism in some way, activist journalism. Where do you see that line? Do journalists have to define themselves as one or the other? Is there a danger of bleeding? Is that part of why journalists have maybe lost some of the faith of the public, because they don't know, they sort of suspect everybody's coming from it with an angle?
Well, everybody is coming from with an angle. We are all we're not computers. We don't analyze external data the way computers do, objectively and without subjective assumptions. We are all the byproduct of so many different subjective components: socioeconomic, cultural, nationalistic, race, ethnicity, religion, whatever it is that we learned, our experiences. We're all subjective beings. And I don't understand at all the idea that we're supposed to indulge the pretense that because we're journalists, we have somehow liberated ourselves from the bonds of subjectivity, that we speak from this kind of place of God, this kind of mountaintop, this view from nowhere, where we simply describe things as they are and don't allow our own subjective assumptions or opinions to infect them. And the question that this gentleman here in the front row asked about why credibility has been lost in the media, I think that is a really important reason, is that it's kind of a fraud to go before people and say, I'm objective, I don't have opinions, my opinions don't seep into the things that I'm saying. People know that's deceitful. They know that that's a lie. So I would much rather, as a consumer of news, know what it is that the person who's telling me what I should know, what they're actually believing and thinking, the prism through which they're evaluating things. And so I knew that when I started reporting on the Snowden stuff and reporting on surveillance, I could have pretended, like a couple of the journalists did at some news organizations that we gave documents to, that I didn't have an opinion about surveillance one way or the other. Like, surveil, don't surveil, that's not my place, I'm just here to tell you what's going on. But I would have been completely dishonest, and I would have been hamstrung in what I could do and say. I thought it was much more important to say, here's what's being done, and now I'm going to tell you why this is so menacing, so that people understood the perspective from which I was doing this reporting. I actually think that all forms of journalism, even the ones that pretend that they're not, are forms of activism, because they're serving somebody's interest, they're adopting somebody's assumptions, they're making choices about who's relevant and who isn't, who's worth hearing and who isn't worth hearing. So I think this whole concept, this whole dichotomy, the objective journalist versus opinion journalism or activism, is this really artificial one that has been manufactured by corporations to neuter journalism, to make it weak and boring. And I do see journalism as being worthwhile only to the extent that it actually has an effect on the world, which means you have to engage people and enroll them and interact with the world in an authentic way. And so I don't shy away from the views that I have or the goals that I'm striving for, because I think it's a much more honest form of journalism to disclose those rather than to hide them.
Okay, I'm going to ask one final question, and then I think we have to let Glenn go because he has other things that he has to do, including the Allard Prize ceremony, which is coming up. But since there are a lot of young journalists in the room, for those who want to help fight corruption and fight for human rights, what advice do you have for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question that I really like talking about, and in part it's because I did enter journalism through a pretty unconventional route, as Peter mentioned earlier. I was a lawyer just minding my own business in 2002 and 2003, and I decided I wanted to be part of this political conversation, and so started a blog, and then just kind of started expressing myself. So I think that one of the things that happens in lots of professions, I saw it in law, I've definitely seen it in journalism, is that a lot of times you begin with a certain passion, like you have a vision of what you want to do as a journalist, what makes you go to journalism school that excites you and enlivens you and animates you. And then the whole process is just designed to suck that all out of you. To just crush your soul, kind of turn you into this cog into the machinery. And I think it's so important to just have a really clear idea of what the passion was that originally motivated you to want to do this, and to cling to it really tightly. So even if there are times when you're making compromises that you have to make, you're going to take this job even though it's not ideal because it'll advance your ability to get to where you want to go, or there's no other alternative and you have to pay your rent. All of which is probably going to happen. It happened to me. You have to just keep hold of what it is that made you excited about doing this in the first place, and just always have that be the North Star of what's driving you. The other thing I would say is, because of the internet, you don't have a guarantee of an audience anymore. 15 years ago, if you went to work for the big paper in Ottawa or the big paper in Montreal or Toronto, you would have a guaranteed audience because everybody was captive to that newspaper because there's only one newspaper. Now, nobody has to read anyone that doesn't interest them. And so you have a much greater burden to offer something of value to people that makes them want to read you instead of the 20 million other things they could be doing on the internet. And to do that, I think it's so important not to try and have a view on everything, not to write about everything. Develop a real interest in and expertise in a small number of topics that really interest you, so that what you're offering is actually unique, and so that people can't get it in lots of other places. They can only get it from you. And if you do that, it might be slow, it might be hard work, but you will develop an audience and a following and be able to make an impact.